were still owned by families. They were still above ground. And what if you were living in a mud hut? Maybe it's a nice mud hut, right? It's got some decent mud on the walls, and right, but it's a mud hut. And just down the road, that is sticking out of the ground. What looks to you bigger than your entire city, but is really just a tiny little citadel back in the day. What do you do with that? How do you deal with that? The existence of something like this in your world, it's like alien technology basically to you. What does that say to you? Who built this? Well, the Greeks actually said the giants with the one eyes, the Cyclopes, built these things. They call them the Cyclopean walls. But if you think about that, who would live there? Okay, so they had the help of these basically superhuman monsters to build this thing. Who lived in a place like this? Ordinary people, like you and I? Greater, better, stronger people. Maybe even in Greek myth, a different race of human beings. Right? Fundamentally different from the weak little humans that are running around now. This is one of the stories they told themselves when they're looking back at these things. Right? So if you imagine 1,000 years, let's say our civilization ended, and hundreds of years later they're looking at the skyscrapers in New York. They know they can't build them. Who did that? What were those people like that did this thing that's just incomprehensible to us? And to us, we look at this and we're like, whatever, right? It would be expensive, but could we do this? Yeah, of course. Technologically speaking, it's not a problem. It still costs a ridiculous amount of money to cut the stones that way and have them actually fit together and be done right. But yeah, it's not as impressive. But imagine you're literally, the height of your architecture is a mud hut, and then there's that. It's going to freak you out. You're going to have to find a way to explain the existence of something like this. So, it's the Lion Gate, Mycenaean images, for instance. Going have them call them lions, all that kind of stuff. So all this is really sticking out. There are no lions in Greece as well, right? How do you explain that? Right? How do you explain these huge cut stones and doorways designed in a way that are far beyond what we can do? Okay, now in the very core of this large central complex in the middle of the city, you'll have one particular structure. And you'll only get one. Right? Each time we found one of these centers, it only has one of these. It'll be really long and axial. It'll have columns, very much in the Minoan style. Lots of cut stone. And you'll move through it finally to an area with a great big hearth in the middle, 4 columns around it, and very often a seat right over there. And it's frequently right in the center, right at the top of wherever you happen to go. And that room would look something like that. Now, we, because of the things that we have learned, because of the stories and the Disney that we've been watching since we were little children, right? We're going to automatically interpret this one way, which is what? Who sits in that chair? The king, right? Do we know that, actually? This is the monarchy? What does that even mean? A hereditary monarchy, so it's primogeniture, right? You're basically talking a bunch of medieval feudalism there, aren't you? Really? Do we know that that has anything to do with the Mycenaeans at all? No, we don't know that. We have their writing, but it's only a bunch of text receipts and the names of some of their gods. They don't, unfortunately, write literature down in a way that we get it. Is it possible that this is where the Mycenaean Pope sat? The religious leader of the Mycenaean community? Is that possible? It's entirely possible. Theocracy? It's entirely possible. You don't know this is a king. But how about it's some kind of ruler? Right? Religious and secular. And that ruler uses this particular space to perform being a ruler. Does that make sense? So you're going to rule, you're going to need the spaces, you're going to need the weapons, you're going to need all that stuff so that you can put on a show and perform being ruler. That's what you get. And so that's Mycenae. You'll find a very similar construction. Can you see it here? Megaron. Yeah. Call it throne room, whatever you want, or just call it big room, which is what Megaron means. But essentially, it's just way back in one of these highly articulated spaces with walls entirely covered with what? Well, fresco, and the fresco is frequently monsters, lions, griffins, people killing each other, all the good standard Mycenaean stuff. And does that surprise you if that's on one of the walls? No, not at all, right? Of course there's chariots on the walls. Images of elite women and men with very elaborately dreadlocks, more or less, as you can see. Or even, what's going on there? It appears to be the bull jump, right? So remember how we talked about that being essentially like an international sport, something that's known well beyond just Crete. So it's known on the mainland, it's very famous there, it's known in, for instance, what's now Lebanon and Israel, it's known in Egypt. And it got, as you saw, it's pretty fun to watch, actually, right? Okay. Now, of course, you're also going to have vast amounts of weaponry, especially in their graves. So that grave circle we were talking about, how do you memorialize the dead? Well, or you just throw them in a hole, and that's it. Because they have no story, right? They conquered no cities, they built no cities, they were, grandchildren of no gods, they were just people, right? And it doesn't matter. But this circular form becomes a standard, basically, icon for a hero. And a hero, somebody who's great, somebody who's done something more than just ordinary. You pile up a big mound of earth on top of them, a round mound, a tumulus. And maybe you architecturally elaborate that tumulus like this is. And so this becomes one of the standard ways of marking the shrine of a hero. And heroes to the Greeks are somewhere between God and human. And very importantly, it's something that you can aspire to. Right? So you can suffer great things, you can become a hero. You will die still, right? But that's not the end of your existence. And so many of the Greek cities are going to have shrines, and quite a lot of them are round to the different heroes. Certainly Hercules, but also the founders of most of the Greek colonies are worshipped as heroes. They get actual worship. Not the same kind that you give to the gods that live in the sky, but a different type. More than what we would give to a human. So those are the gravestones from this area. You can see there's a couple of chariots showing you that that's what they do. What else? There's the edge of the built-up area. And inside of it, they had images like this, or mostly like this, golden face masks covering the dead who are still there. They were over 6 feet high. They were massively muscled based on study of their osteology, their bones. So these people were extraordinarily well fed. If we can believe what Homer says, they ate a ridiculous amount of meat. They must have because they were huge. And they spent their lives essentially in physical struggle, right? Not just warfare, but the training for warfare. The beard's probably fake, but the rest of it is real. Probably look more like that to start with. So the Mycenaeans aren't the best artists, but they're really good at murdering people and at sport. So that's good, right? A ridiculous amounts of gold. So all of this, again, you get the sense though that there is the worship of the dead. If you're putting this much wealth, so both the swords, which are useful and made of gold and bronze, but also imported objects of all types, ivory, beautiful inlaid daggers like this one. You see what I mean? You must have some kind of a sense that the dead are still important. You're not just throwing them in a hole. Okay, good. Now, as they continue to evolve from the very end of their culture, they began to produce these enormous underground circular tombs called Phallus tomb. So this particular one is Treasure of Atreus. And again, there's something present in the landscape that you're going to be looking at as you go into the classical period of Greece. What we have essentially is a couple of walls to keep the dirt from falling in, a really huge doorway, possibly very decorated, and then a large circular area in the middle underneath this cobbled wall. These can be used for multiple generations. Once you stick the dead in the middle, and once they rot away, somebody else dies, perhaps you just open the door again and you put kind of scoop them to the side and put somebody else right in the middle. You definitely did that a lot in Athens chamber tombs there. But regardless, it's monumentalization of the graveyard. Right? This is important. Right? So it's not just a place where you put dead people, it's a place where you perform ritual. And this is going to continue to be the case. So just for scale, there's Professor Hitchner in front of one of the doorways. You can see the size of these cut these stones. Just on the sides of the doorway, there's one particular structure. So it's a huge amount of wealth that's been burned up and hours of labor necessary to create all this cut stone and make it work properly. And of course, imported stones of various kinds, cut in very precise ways. So again, you guys get the sense, yes? Right? Death and the dead. Some of the dead are not equal. That's the important part. Okay. Good. Now, this is just for your, to get a sense of how broad it is. This is the inside kind of map. Now, if you're thinking about this in terms of a culture, which is crucially important for what we're trying to do, this technology, you shouldn't see it one time, right? You should begin to see it everywhere. If this is really a symbol of something more than just a hole to throw someone in, you would imagine it becoming sort of a status symbol. And in fact, it's exactly what you find. And so when you go, in fact, all over the Mycenaean world, you will begin to find this type of structure, right? So all around the city of Mycenae, there are many of them. But then there are many, many others. Right? So remember this one. Here's the pathway in. There was the door. It had the vault, but it's now collapsed in. This is a relatively minor one, relatively close to Mycenae, some 5 miles away. But so this, in their entire world, this is the top level. If you're a really important person, this is how you get buried. And locally, you see the stones of the doorway were really huge, yes? What about these, though? Kind of small and crappy, right? So this person is definitely not as wealthy as the one that created that other one. But the form of it, the shape of it, question?
I'm just trying to wrap my head around this. Are the Mycenaeans after the Minoans, before like what we call Greeks, or where do they fall?
That's a good question. So they are basically already in existence for the entire period when the Minoans are ruling on Crete, and they control the Greek mainland. The Minoans control Crete and a couple of sites in some of the islands. About 1450 or so, you have what appears to be an invasion of Crete by the Mycenaeans. Right, so they take over all of Crete. They don't kill all the Minoans, but they take control. And so you begin to see, instead of linear A, which is Minoan language, you begin to see linear B writing, which is Greek. Right, so the Mycenaeans are Greeks. And they are the ones, essentially, that are being talked about in Homer, which is what we're going to get to in a little bit. Right? Because Homer is kind of a strange echo of this world. It starts off in a world where there are real things and real places you can go, and Troy is a real place that we just burned to the ground. But over the course of several centuries and the collapse of civilization, it's transformed into myth. Right, so we'll get to that. But yeah, so they're the same period. And they're going to go down to about 1200. You're going to start seeing a really severe problem. By the time you reach 1100 BC, you have essentially world collapse of civilization. We'll talk about that. But before that, they are all using this symbol, right? The top level, the important people. And I think we can say they consider themselves to be, in a sense, more than human. Right? Stories we get from myth later, the heroes are all demigods, basically. They're half-gods, they're grandsons of Zeus, or the sons of Zeus, or something like that, or some other god. Right? And so they're more than that. Now, what if, after Greek civilization comes back, right, so about 8th, 9th century BC, beginning of the Iron Age, these things are all sticking out. You can see that they are graves. Who are you going to think is in there if you're a Greek of the historical period? Random guy. They're pretty clearly the same kind of people that were building those other crazy things that you can't build, right? So are these ordinary humans? If you're a Greek, no, they're heroes. And so very frequently, these tombs become the sites where heroes are worshipped. And so people will specifically come here and conduct chthonic, that is to say, a ritual for those who are under the ground. That's a form of worship of more than human entities. So these are sacred sites, the ones that are known. Even down into the Roman period, in fact, there are several of these that still have active, ongoing worship of heroes associated with them. I think you can see, again, they vary quite a bit in level of quality. This one's nicely cut with pretty small stones, right? Got uncovered, collapsed. There's another one from a different direction, as you can see. Or this, crappy, trying to fall in, as is this one. Okay, cool. Any questions on this? Does this make sense? So this is a symbol of something more. And it's going to continue on down. And there's another one. At Mycenaean itself. Okay. It's not for you to memorize, but just to get a sense. The way it can be constructed is very different. The scale, the quality, but not the shape, not the symbol. That's consistent. Okay. Good. All right. Now, so the Mycenaeans, we can say definitely they're way into charioteering, right? They love the warfare for sure. What else, though? We've got some images of bull leaping, but we have no central courts at all in any of the Mycenaean cities. What does that probably tell you? What do you guys think?
They didn't do it themselves.
Or at least they didn't feel that that particular venue is necessary. Does that make sense to everybody? Right. Whatever that was to the Minoans, amusing apparently to the Mycenaeans, but they apparently, we have no real evidence that they were doing it. Whatever it was. Now, as you get to about 1300 BC, the Mycenaean cities, right, all of these, many, of course, many hundreds of tiny ones, these are major cities. They are essentially like Vikings. You can think of them, they get in these basically long Viking rowboats with about 50 people each, called a black ship. And they will go out in large numbers and attack various areas, each other and other places. So I told you they'd already taken over all of the Minoan civilization. And in fact, we have diplomatic records from this period where the kings of the Hittites, because there is in fact an international system of diplomacy, right, as well as trade and exchange, the Hittites are essentially complaining about unprovoked attacks on Lusa, which is the ancient name of Troy. So, again, it gives you a sense that they're basically causing trouble. Right? They're doing a little bit too much of it. And those of you who have read the Iliad know that warfare and the glory that you get from warfare is very dear to the heart of the ancient Greeks. So you can imagine how this would go, right? So they're frequently very aggressive, and it seems extremely likely that they did, in fact, come together, a large number of their cities, with a very large fleet, and sailed over and destroyed Troy. Now, here is the fun. So, imagine a system that's not actually much different from our system. International trade, international diplomacy. How long could the United States live economically without international trade? If all international trade just stopped, what would happen? Or even if it went down by 25%, let's say, what would happen? It would be catastrophic, right? So imagine a world very much like that, where the elites of the ancient Greeks, the Mycenaeans, they rely on international trade to fund the structure of their society. To remain king, you need to be able to give away lots of stuff to your followers. You need to be able to provide all the different things that are expected, to hold the games, right? Hold the giant feasts. What if international trade starts to fall off, and you no longer have the ability to behave like you're supposed to behave to preserve your power? So what it seems to happen, in fact, is a climatic bubble. Occasionally you get, in the history of mankind, periods of 5-10 years where the climate goes a little bit wonky, and you have not the complete cessation of agriculture, but you have reduced yields, right? Remember, they don't have phosphorus, fertilizers, they don't have electric water pumps to suck the water out of the Ogallala aquifer and spread it all over where it shouldn't be, right? You guys know about this? They don't have any of that. So if you have unnecessary, excessive fluctuations in the weather, even a little bit of a sustained dry spell for the Nile, for instance, doesn't flood well enough for a period of a few years, you can have basically a disruption in the economy because much of the economy is coming from agriculture. All right, now that's not enough to bring down the entire world system, is it? So if you think about, for instance, like 2008, you guys were around for that, we had a major earthquake in the international financial system. It could have been vastly worse. It was not, because it was dealt with more or less correctly. What if, however, you had a number of very highly armed, highly trained, large populations of people who strongly valued glory gained from warfare? And what if their economies went south? They were already engaged in fighting each other occasionally and attacking other places like Crete. What if there were like a giant mega recession and a huge number of armed people? What might happen? Well, economy by other means, maybe. Why not just go and, okay, well, we destroyed Troy, which is something like destroying New York. Think about how important something that would control the flow back and forth between Europe and Asia and back and forth to the Black Sea region. If you knock that out, that's not going to be good for international finance. If you then knock out several other of these sites, do you then want to put your goods onto a boat and sail in the Aegean if there's just basically ridiculous amounts of these people running around? You can't. And if you do that, then what happens? Then there's internal societal problems, right? Which makes the international system even more troubled. Okay, so essentially, what had always been for several hundred years problematic, right? So the Mycenaeans and other peoples of this region had always been a little bit warlike, occasionally knocking off the city, but it became a feedback loop, essentially. Too many of the major trade centers were destroyed too close together. And so if you lost New York 1 year, and then you lost London 5 years later, and then you lost Berlin 5 years after that, what's the world economy look like? It's trashed, right? And so the entire structure slowly, right, not on one day, but over the course of multiple decades of gradual loss of one economic center after another, until everything that was of any importance except Egypt was destroyed. So all the major cities, and the Mycenaeans even destroyed all of their own cities as well. Right? So Mycenae, Pylos, everything burned to the ground, destroyed. So the entire world system, the economy, diplomacy, comes crashing down. Right? The whole thing. The Egyptians do hold out militarily, but without the entire rest of the world to basically trade with, they succumb to internal structural problems. And the unified Egyptian state breaks up into smaller units. Right? So they're not in as bad a shape as the rest of people, but they've lost their unified government. Now, practically speaking, what does it mean for the Greeks? It means basically a super fast trip right back to the Stone Age. So, in essence, if you think about this, so let's say that you are a stonemason, okay? Let's say it would take you 3 weeks to cut one of those stones. But now, no one else is building like that. People are building mud huts because they're just literally just trying to stay alive. Nobody can afford to pay you for that. So what are you going to build now? You're going to still build giant massive walls and architecture and highly sophisticated? No, you're not, right? You're going to try to stay alive. What if you're a potter? Right? What if you work in ivory? You're a carver of ivory. There's no ivory coming up through Egypt across the Aegean, right? There is no trade happening to Greece. Right? If you're making really fine pottery, there's nobody to buy it. Can you see how within one generation, if this doesn't recover within one generation, you're going to lose all that technology, all that skill, right? All the architecture, pottery skills, the metallurgy, right? The social skills, the writing system, right? So literally all the way back to the Stone Age in terms of technology. They're living in basically mud huts with stone bottoms, no writing system, barely surviving in most places. Okay, that's grim, right? So climate change. Climate change is really bad, right? Not because the climate change is necessarily itself going to bring down the Western organized world, but the disruption to the international system could. That's the real danger I would submit to you for global warming. It's not that we're all going to starve. It's not going to collapse the entire system for warfare just like this. So, what's left then? We don't have any of those things. So do they stop worshiping the Greek gods? Do you have to have metallurgical technology to worship Athena? What do you guys think? No, right? Not at all. What about things like sport? Foot racing, let's say. Do you have to have incredible wealth to be a foot racer? Wrestling? Boxing? Throwing of heavy weights? Javelin? Most types of sport are still entirely possible, yes? And even a few people are going to have horses, right? So even some of that is still possible. And of course, the Near East and Egypt still maintain a lot of this technology in different places, especially Egypt. So then, just for reference, this is an image of the king and some of the major gods. Right behind the king, so I know you guys aren't trained in this, but essentially this is the king. Here's a bunch of nasty conquered peoples, according to the king of Egypt, Ramesses III. And those are basically Mycenaeans. They're depicted with a pretty typical type of Mycenaean headdress. So basically he brags on several of his major elements about a huge attack, according to him, of the sea peoples, which he was able to then defeat. So it would appear that the Mycenaeans and others and their giant fleets made a couple of different attacks on Egypt, but were unsuccessful. Right? They did not destroy the Egyptians as they had and themselves. Okay. So Egypt is still around, and that's rather important. The Greeks, however, are in a really bad way. So if you think about the sea as being sort of infested with nasty swarms of Vikings, most of your cities used to be right down by the ocean and without walls. What would you do? Personally, what would you guys do if that was the case? Stay by the sea? I'd start going up a mountain. And in fact, what they do is they frequently pull back. So this is the very top of one of the mountains. Here is the farmland. It's a couple hours away by walking. You can see they've done some terracing on the edges of the mountain ridge. They literally pull back all the way to the top of a mountain because they're so scared of the ocean. Right? It's that dangerous. Okay. So their pottery comes back, and we'll talk maybe a little bit more about this, but essentially very simple stuff at first. But again, if most people are living in the most primitive way possible, this is a technological triumph. For the Mycenaean period, this is a piece of crap, right? But when everybody else is basically dealing with Stone Age stuff, and somebody can come out with that, this is technological revolution, right? So owning that means you're very wealthy. And the same thing with, again, this, a wine vessel, or as it gets more complex, notice a person with horses, okay, they're very elite. And then, what's this? Chariot again. Right? So, remember that those are still present in Egypt and also in the Near East. So when the world system begins to recover from the Bronze Age collapse, when trade is reestablished, when international diplomacy, when the Greeks begin to be able to go and serve as mercenaries down in Egypt or down in the Near East. So imagine what you do. You go down to Egypt, you're a mercenary, you work for the Egyptian king, or at least one of them, right? You get money, and you also do what? You see all kinds of crazy advanced technology, right? And then you come home and you've got a bunch of money, and more importantly, you've got a bunch of knowledge about the world. Now here's the fun thing. So imagine even after their civilization has collapsed, about 1000 BC, let's say. Okay? They don't have the architecture, they don't have the technology, but they do have the same religion. And they do have stories. Right? So what starts as stories about how we, the Greeks, came together, went over on the other side of the ocean and attacked the great city of Troy, it turns into myth, right? But that myth has a bunch of embedded little pieces of actual Mycenaean culture, if you think about it, right? The names of the Mycenaean gods, the same ones we still worship. The things that the Mycenaeans wore, like that armor we saw, right? Armor that nobody in Greece would have, but there were still stories about it. Does that make sense? And stories about the games that the Mycenaeans played. Does that make sense? So as things begin to recover, as trade begins to pick up, as social differentiation begins to happen again, technological advances, and wealth begins to flow back into Greece, what do you imagine that they will start to do? Someone tell me. Things have been really bad, but we've been telling ourselves these stories about a better world, a world of great heroes that engaged in sport and warfare with each other in marvelous architectural spaces. What are they going to do? Someone tell me. Right? Okay.
Try to get anything they can do to get back to that, like the good old days.
Yeah. So they're talking, and they don't have any chariots, right? But what do they hear about since the time of the old children, if they're wealthy? They hear somebody come and they hear them tell them about these incredibly exciting things where they're on the back of these really crazy, rickety things shooting behind horses, racing. It sounds like the best thing ever, right? They get wealthy again. They come in contact with the actual technology to produce said chariot in Egypt and the Near East. They come back and they start doing it. And so that's why Homer is so important for the foundation of Greek sport. Is because as they're coming back out of this period of disruption, they already have all these ideas about what it means to be a real Greek, a heroic Greek. And so you see here images of warfare, chariots, and the dead person. So this is basically a giant wine vessel, a keg, basically, for a party. And on it has the dead person. So this is being used as a grave marker. Here's another one, as you can see. A whole bunch of people with oars and a ship. Person grabbing female by the arms, probably Paris and Helen. He's kidnapping her and taking her to Troy. Because this story is still around. They don't have to have writing. They never did. Because it's not a story written in a book that you read. It's a story that you listen to. Right? From the time you're little children, the stories and myths they tell you. And so as you come out of this period of collapse, by the time you get to the 8th century and down to the 6th century, there is an explosion of Greek culture across the entire Mediterranean and beyond. Right? So these cities that we were barely hanging on, their populations spike. They increase exponentially. So what do you do if you have X amount of land, and now you have twice as many people as you need to actually farm said land and do everything in your society? You can either have 50% unemployment, or you can do what? Send them somewhere else, right? So basically convince them to get on a bunch of boats. Hey, you know what would be super? Why don't half of you guys sail from here all the way across the Mediterranean, all the way up to southern France. And you're going to build a brand new city in the middle of a bunch of people who do not speak Greek and probably don't like you at all. Does this sound like a good idea? You guys want to volunteer for this? Does this sound good? I mean, imagine if they were like Mars, were filled with actual violent Martians, and people said, you know, unemployment's kind of bad. Why don't we put a bunch of our young people on spaceships and go land on Mars? They'll be fine, right? They won't mind. And we'll just put. This sounds like a terrible idea, right? And frequently it was. Frequently this doesn't work at all. Some of them become Marseille, which is where that came from. Others get, exterminated by the local people. But this is the Greek world of the origin of sport. It's not just the Greek mainland right here. It's literally anywhere there are ethnically Greek people who speak Greek, right? People who come ultimately from some other Greek city. So they are in what they call an apoikia, a colony, if you want, and they come from the mother city, the metropolis. They trace themselves back to some unambiguously Greek place. So you may notice, for instance, the entire south of Italy is swarming with Greeks. Same thing with the Black Sea region, Ukraine, South Russia, right? All over, North Africa even. Now the yellow, Phoenicians. The same time period, because the entire world economy is recovering at once, the Phoenicians, who are this extremely advanced seafaring group of people that live primarily along the coast of Levant here, modern Lebanon and North Israel, they enormously expand their activity and grab, in fact, most of North Africa and a lot of South Spain. Okay. So anywhere the Greeks are, that's where sport can be.